Stacey, you and I just had a terrific conversation. How about you tell others about it?
Yeah, it was a wonderful conversation between the son of the late Bishop Ken Goodson Jr., and Bishop Will Willimon. It was a wonderful conversation about Bishop Goodson's life and ministry and legacy.
Yeah, because we're interested in lessons we can learn about courageous leadership, especially for times such as today. Now, for those who are not familiar with Kenneth Goodson, he was born in Spencer, raised going to First Methodist in Salisbury, went to Catawba College, where he sensed his calling to be a Methodist pastor, served many congregations, including First Methodist in Wadesboro, where Stacey has been serving these past 4 years, was elected a bishop in 1964, was a leader for the church during civil rights, retired, and then became the bishop in residence at his beloved Duke Divinity School. And of course, the Goodson Chapel is there now, named in his memory, right in the shadow of Duke Chapel. There's so much, I think, for us to learn from Bishop Goodson's life. What are some of the highlights for you from this conversation?
Sure, I loved that Bishop Goodson was born and raised and served in Western North Carolina. It made me wonder about leadership lessons from someone like him. He seemed to be so relational and personable and really care about people, and yet he had such a huge impact on our system and on issues such as civil rights. So I loved hearing from Ken Goodson Jr. about how much he loved his dad and how proud he was, and Bishop Willimon's stories about him. What did you like, Mark?
Oh, I loved hearing all of that, and I believe others will enjoy hearing it too. Take a listen.
When I was behaving, he was loving and gentle. When I was not, he was stern and opinionated. But he was a wonderful, warm human being, intelligent, and probably to this day the best preacher that I've ever seen in the pulpit.
I remember coming into the ministry, somebody said to me, an older, wiser person said, choose your mentors wisely. And I love that y'all are lifting up Ken Goodson as a mentor for such time as this. When I first met him, I was a young professor at the Divinity School. He was Bishop, Virginia Conference, but I had heard him a couple times as a youth at Lake Junaluska preach, and he was larger than life, and he was known as a character, and known far and wide for his deep prejudicial love of Duke and Duke Divinity School. When I came back as dean of the chapel, he and I became really close, and he preached the installation sermon that fall. Bob Durden wrote the biography of William Preston Few, the Methodist who founded Duke University from South Carolina.
Wofford College.
And Wofford, thank you. And Bob called me and he said, "You got to come over to the library and see this." I went over there and there was a letter from a letter, and it said, "I am Kenneth Goodson. I am so pleased that I have been admitted to Duke Divinity School in the fall. But alas, I find that the cost of admission and tuition is $50. But he said, I'm from a family of limited means, and I've invested all that we have to get through college, and I don't have the money, but I have a dream. I have a lifetime dream of coming to Duke Divinity School. Is there any help, Dr. Few, that you know of that I might have, a job or whatever? And on the bottom of the letter, Few wrote, uh, uh, tell the boy we'll handle it. And Bob Durden looked at that. He said, "That's the best $50 Duke University ever invested in anybody." Said, "We got that $50 back." And I said, that says so much about William Preston Few, but also about Ken Goodson.
About once a year in his sermons, one of the stories would be that on a snowy Sunday morning, President Few was crossing the Duke campus in the snow, and a Duke undergrad stopped him and greeted him and said, "Oh, President Few, here we are in the snow. When did you decide to go to church?" And he said, "Son, about 50 years ago." And to him, that was it. You didn't make up your mind on Sunday morning, well, it's sunny, I think I'll go to church. You know,
It's
that
wonderful.
it was a lifelong decision.
Yeah.
He was a classic storyteller. And I mean, on any given Sunday, he could take you from tears to laughter in a nanosecond. You know, I mean, I've still shed many tears and laughed out loud during the course of one of his sermons.
I came across a quote. Somebody asked your dad, when did you receive your call to preach? And he responded by saying, "The first time was over 50 years ago when I was a student at Catawba College in Salisbury, North Carolina. The last time was today during my morning prayers."
Isn't that wonderful?
Mhm.
Elocution died when Ken Goodson died. We will not see that kind of elocution ever again. And a lot of other public speaking virtues too. And I remember one of his dear friends on the Duke faculty was Stuart Henry,
Yes.
American church historian. And Stuart used to say that Ken Goodson, anything he talks about is an exercise in elocution. I'll say, "Ken, what time did you leave yesterday afternoon, leave the office?" And he said, Ken will say, "Around 5, I gathered my belongings and I moved toward the door. I went out of the door. I went into the parking lot, into the still setting sun. I went to my car. I laid my hand upon the door. I opened the door." And and he said, Ken is wonderful. So he was a preacher.
I was talking to my son, who is Trinity 95. And I was talking with him the other day, told him what we're getting ready to do and talk about Dad. And he says, "I'll never forget," he said, he could put 14 syllables into the word church.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You know,
Lord Jesus.
And it would just linger on.
He lingered, loved words with delight. And he was a masterful comedian when out of the pulpit. He also
sometimes in the pulpit.
Sometimes in the pulpit, great.
And I'm sure that Stacey saw this in her reading of Bill Nichols's book. Numerous references to the fact that Dad was personable. Stacey, how many times did that book say a scholar, but he didn't present himself as one. You know, I mean, at one point in time, Boston University asked him to write a book of his sermons. Well, if you've ever heard him preach, his sermons do not lend themselves to translating to a written format. If you never heard him preach in his prime, if you can find him somewhere, first of all, anything that you can copy on there as far as techniques, or just listen to the way he said what he said. It's pretty cool. So,
Well, I got to tell you, it's always heartwarming for me to hear you talk about your father in such high regard and such great affection. And I can hope that maybe one of my kids will say that about me someday.
if one of them does, you have accomplished great things.
By the way, I also remember in Alabama, and one of the great privileges of getting to be Bishop of Alabama was getting to hear Ken Goodson stories. And I heard many stories. When I mentioned that to your mother, she said, I'm sure some of them could be true. And your mother, by the way, presented me with Ken's robe. And I wore it the whole time I was in Alabama and thought it protected me like it protected Ken.
Doris and I were living in Northern Virginia when my dad died. And it's a phone call I won't soon forget. But the next day in the Washington Post, the Post in the obit section used to have a section that they referred to as deaths of note. So it could be interesting people from around the country who had died within the last several days.
Mm-hmm.
It was the first time that I had seen this definition of my dad. And I still have the little clipping that I cut out, who was credited with helping reconcile Alabamians during the battles of the Civil Rights era. Mr. Goodson was elected to the United Methodist Episcopacy in 1964 and was appointed to the Birmingham area of the church. He became active in behalf of civil rights and racial peace, and later served as bishop in residence at Duke University. That definition of my dad sort of stopped me in my tracks. I had some idea of what was going on in Alabama during that time, but I don't think that I had ever seen that definition of him. And it did warm my heart so.
My first week in Birmingham, a district superintendent of the Birmingham district and I were riding around. He was showing me around town, but he said, I'll never forget, said, Bishop Goodson was too good to drive himself anywhere. So he would always enlist young clergy to drive him various places. And if you'd spend like 2 or 3 days or a week being his chauffeur in the evenings. And once you did, he would give you a tie. Because he, said he loved good clothes, loved to dress well. Anyway, he said, I picked him up one evening and he said, son, things will get a little rough here tonight. Said, these people are unhappy with me. And he said, I gulped and said, sure enough, we pulled up at that church and here were about 5 lay people. He pointed right up at the top of those steps. And so I sighed, we got out of the car and walked up the steps. and lay people standing there with their arms folded. And they greeted him, and one of them said, "Bishop, we don't want any trouble, but if any of them try to come in this church, we got a little surprise for them." And he patted his coat, and Mickey said, "My Lord, the man has a pistol." And he said, Bishop Goodson said, looked at him with contempt, and as only he could do. And his ability to look at someone with utter contempt, anyway, it was a gift.
Yeah.
But he said, he turned to me and he said, "Son, give me my pad, please." And said he wrote on the pad all this and ripped off the paper and handed it to the man. And the man said, "What is this supposed to mean?" And Bishop Goodson said, "Oh my, you can't read either? Let me read it for you. It says, you are hereby dismissed as a member of the United Methodist Church, according to paragraph 328.4, Kenneth Goodson, presiding bishop, Birmingham area." And he said, "You can't do that." And he said, "Well, obviously you've never read paragraph 238.4 of the Methodist Book of Discipline." He said, "Now, all the Methodists are getting ready to have a meeting tonight. If you non-Methodists could excuse us, thank you." And said he walked in there and basically slammed the door in the man's face. We had a meeting, and it went so well. Bishop Goodson charmed everybody, and the meeting went fine. He said, on the way home, I said, "I didn't know that a Methodist bishop could kick somebody out of the church." And Bishop Goodson said, "You think that redneck fool is going to read the discipline?" One afternoon, early on, I spent the afternoon in the archives of the conference, going through there, particularly when Ken was bishop. I found there were a number of angry, some of them profane letters written to Bishop Goodson, calling him names, etc., and letters from pastors. And one letter from a pastor said, "Oh, Bishop Goodson, things were going so well. I tried to preach on the civil rights and all, and I thought, but they had a meeting and they say they want us out of the parsonage this week, and I don't know what to do, but I'm really getting fearful that my family and I might be in danger." And Ken wrote at the bottom of the letter, "Joe, can't you find somewhere good for Tommy?" Said, "I'm very proud of him. Get in touch with him immediately." And it was a note to the district superintendent, I presume. So that was the climate in which he worked.
And I would be amiss if we didn't talk just a few minutes about Bloody Sunday and what was going on at those churches at that time. And Bill Simpson is a renowned minister in the North Carolina Conference. At some point early in his career, when he was a young seminarian at Emory and was serving a pastorate in Selma, Alabama. He was 19 years old, probably the youngest preacher in town. He had his sermon that morning with his congregation. And then in the afternoon, there was a lay conference where Dad was preaching. At the time that the tear gas canisters and the weapons and the bullhorns and everything else started going off. So at the end of the service, Bill Simpson and a couple of the other ministers who were there got Dad aside and said, here's what has just taken place on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Let's go see what this is about. So they walked as a group together. By that time, everything at the Edmund Pettus Bridge had dissolved, and people had disseminated. And so all of the young Methodist ministers, young, I would say, and their bishop knelt in prayer and then dismissed. But the most interesting thing is, in just a recent publication on a commentary that Bill Simpson wrote on this year's anniversary of Bloody Sunday, it was so eloquent. And anybody who has the opportunity, first of all, Bishop, you got quoted, but anybody who has the opportunity to pull that up or find it from one source or another, it is a wonderful read. It was a great read for the son of the bishop, but it's a great read for any Methodist of goodwill. It was just superb. I think what his comment was, anyway, something to the effect of we should all emulate Ken Goodson if we can. Does that seem like something you would say? I think it is something that you've said numerous times.
That sure is.
Today.
Yeah,
So,
that's wonderful.
yeah.
When I was named bishop in Alabama, a newspaper story was done on me, and the newspaper reporter said he is renowned as a conservative voice in the church for about the Christian tradition or something. Anyway, I thought that was odd. Never had that applied to me. Anyway, I got a letter from a Tom Radney on his legal stationery and said, well, glad to have you come down here from Duke to be our bishop. But I got to tell you, said, they say you're a conservative. I got to tell you, we're kind of full up in Alabama right now with conservatives, and we're not looking for any more. And he said, but come on down, and I'm a Methodist. I'll try to help you. So I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, I've been called a lot of things, but nobody has ever called me a conservative or traditionalist. So I said, I want to reassure you and all. And so we laughed and we talked, and he said, but I got to warn you, said, I hope to meet you, hope we become friends, but my expectations for bishops are pretty high because there'll never be another one like Ken Goodson. And I said, well, that's a sign of your intelligence. There never will be another one like Ken Goodson, and I will certainly not be like Ken Goodson. But I said, he's a dear friend, and I miss him. And he said, I'll tell you, I had taken a couple of cases that earned me the enmity of a lot of people in Alexander City. And he said there was threats and trouble. But I'm sitting in my law office here in Alexander City, and I hear my receptionist, secretary, and she said, and you are who? Bishop Abraham? And she said, well, he's working on a case now, and he's busy. And said, I heard this bass voice said, he'll see me. And so said, suddenly the door flung open, and there was Ken Goodson standing in the doorway. And he said, Thomas Radney? And he said, yes. He said, and he said he strode forward with his hand out. And he said, I'm your bishop, Kenneth Goodson, and I've come to meet you. And he said, my bishop? Why? And he said, I don't have long, so I'll get right to the point. I've come from Birmingham to tell you your bishop is very proud of you and the stance you have taken. I know it has been difficult, but I am proud and I hope, I pray that your courage and your witness, I hope that that was engendered in you by the ministrations of the Methodist Church. And Tom Radney said, I hadn't thought about it. I guess maybe it has. And he said, good. He said, rise. And Tom said, I stood up. He said, come around here, please. And he said, I came around to Bishop Goodson. He said, kneel. And he said, here. And he said, here. And he said, I knelt down in my law office. Kenneth Goodson laid hands on my head and said, Lord, you know Tom, one of your flock. Tom has been doing some courageous things. He has been saying some things that made a lot of people mad. Lord, we are bold to pray for your protection and care of Tom Radney. And he's got a voice that few have. Lord, you need Tom Rodney, and the church needs him. We're proud of him and all. And Tom said, I just collapsed and I was weeping on the floor of my office. And Bishop Goodson said, Tom, good to talk to you. Please call me if I can ever be of assistance to you in your ministry. And walked out. And he said, that was the summit of my Christian life that afternoon.
Phew.
And I said, Tom, I don't know how to be a bishop. I never envisioned myself in this situation. Thank you for educating me. So.
Well, it's funny you say that you had never been called a conservative. I was looking, among other things, at this wonderful book that William Nicholas wrote that you have written on the back of.
Yeah.
And what a wonderful piece of scholarship that book is. Mm-hmm. And it gave me insight into my dad that I had never seen before, but it was
good. It's wonderful.
Oh, it is wonderful. And his reputation when he went to Alabama was as in the mold of conservative Southern bishops. It had never, or conservative Southern ministers, he had never really seen himself in print anywhere as a progressive. I can tell you, growing up in that parsonage, he was a progressive because we got to be talk some things outside the church, I guess. But I was not surprised that when push came to shove, that was the Ken Goodson that emerged. That level of pride that I have in what he accomplished in Alabama and the legacy that he left there with, warms my heart.
It was wonderful, and I think Ken was he loved tradition. He was a conservative. However, he had a deep sense of vocation and responsibility to that vocation. um, and love of and subservience to, I guess is the right word, the Methodist Church. Bob Wilson taught polity classes at Duke, and these two guys can tell you, at least my attitude is, polity is like the most boring subject in seminary, and I couldn't stand polity classes, and have always refused to be part of them. But there was a tradition at the divinity school of Ken coming in. He would come in the last class, and he would talk about Methodist polity, but he talked about it in the sense of he would tell stories about his own experiences, being grateful for the book of discipline and the guidance it gave. But he would always end by telling some story from Alabama. And he says, this congregation had turned into a mob. People were screaming ugly, vile things. And I stood there. I stood there and I stared them down. And I said, this is where I stand. I will not be moved. And he said, I am not a courageous person by nature, but and he said, I stood there in face of this threatening mob. And with that, he would hold up the book of discipline. And he said, nothing protected me. Nothing stood between me and a horrible end. He said, but this little book, this book, and it can enable you to be better than who you think you are as well.
It's funny, but
And the class would, people were crying, people were weeping, shouting, standing ovation. And Bob said it was just wonderful. And he said it was the most relevant class of the whole semester. Your sister, I guess it's your sister in Birmingham? That's your
yes,
sister?
Sister
Yeah.
Nancy Richards.
Nancy. Yeah, she gave me a picture of him, a framed picture. And I had that on the wall of my office in Birmingham, right at the front door as you come in the office. And I used to always look at it, and I would think, Ken, it seems to me Ken is looking with sort of mild contempt, maybe not so mild at me. And and I put in a book somewhere about one day I came to by and I said, Ken, you had it easy in Alabama. All you had to worry about was the Ku Klux Klan, getting your house bombed, stuff like that. I'm the bishop. It's got to close all of your good ideas that you started. Now that the camp is bankrupt, the hospital that you adopted is bankrupt. I'm the one that's got to do that. And I said, Ken said to me from the picture, would you stop whining and go to work? You've got good work to do. I think it's wonderful to think of Ken as exemplar for us. In fact, when students at the divinity school will say things like, I've never seen America more divided, because I think, you're 22 years old, so you ain't seen that
Yes.
much.
Right.
But they will talk about all the tensions in the church and the divisions and the fierce opposition. And I say, I'm sorry, I ain't got much patience with you. I came into ministry in South Carolina in 1970. And when I came out of seminary, it was clear to me I was going into a war. My heroes were Methodist preachers, many of whom had gotten hurt badly. and had difficulty. And so I go around telling pastors, where did we get the notion that serving Jesus was always going to be pleasant and that there wouldn't be contentiousness and argument and fights? So I guess I'm saying that the time that Ken was leading our church it's a time that I think all total was a great time to show what the gospel can do. Really, in Methodism's present moment, and I got a book coming out in August about the disaffiliation of my home church, Buckham Street, where Ken preached a number of times and all.
Right.
And I think Methodism is paying a high price for not having strong leadership like Ken Goodson gave us. Anyway, there's just been so many moments when I thought Ken Goodson would have found a way for this not to happen. He would have found a way to compromise, to reach agreement, to refuse to allow people to do un-Methodist thing. Anyway, so
To cajole.
cajole.
There was a line in William Nicholas's book. He was a United Methodist bishop, and as such was committed to the end of segregation within the church. In other words, if this was the position of the church, that was his position.
That book, Ken, was really wonderful. As I read, I was struck that Bishop Goodson seemed to be a relational leader, and also he didn't seem to style himself as a prophet, and yet he had a profound impact for justice in Alabama.
One of the things that we were aware of, my sister Ann, who sadly passed away last year, and I, who stayed in North Carolina. And one of the first comments that Dad's made when he got to Alabama, he said, "Well, this could be interesting." We said, "In what way?" And he said, "Among the Methodists that are in my flock are George Wallace, Bull Connor, Bobby Shelton, who was the state Klan leader, and Richmond Flowers."
Wow.
Who was about the only politician to ever push back on George Wallace. So he had, his flock was a whole lot of people who needed ministering to, the least of whom was Richmond Flowers, probably. But yeah, so it was sort of like, this is what I'm facing, but they are Methodist. They are my flock.
I like both of your characterizations of Ken, that Ken didn't think of himself as a prophet, a social activist or anything, but he thought of himself as someone called by the church to administer the church in accordance with the doctrines and practices of the church. And in doing that, in being obedient to that, he did some very courageous prophetic things. And I think that's a story worth telling. And maybe it makes all the more remarkable that in a way he was a deeply traditionalist, conservative person, but that his vocation as minister and pastor and bishop, his vocation enabled him to show that he was courageous and bold, and he was relational. And I think that's another thing. He pushed people without their knowing they were being pushed, and he got people to agree to many things that they might have been opposed to, but he just had such a gift for connecting with people, for getting people to like him. And I think people felt like Ken Goodson generally liked them, and the students at the divinity school, the hundreds of students there'd be the line outside his door to get him to make phone calls for students to boards of ministry and the district superintendents. And I bet during his last years, Ken did more weddings for divinity school graduates, and that was a big part of his leadership, was his affection for people, his connections with people. He leveraged, not making it, I don't want to make it sound cynical or in any way, but just for good.
Yeah. And I tell you, there are a few Methodist preachers' kids named Kenneth out there.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I say in the book, I think I say, thank God Ken Goodson didn't have your attitudes back in the 60s, or there wouldn't be any United Methodist churches in Alabama. Just think of all the people who would never have been converted on race if we had caved and said, well, this is your opinion, and your opinion means more than the teaching of the church. So, bye.
I mean, Methodist to a core describes him. And I don't know what his church could have asked of him that he would have balked on, except maybe disillusion.
Again, the more I think about it, I think you're right that the main source of his virtue was he was faithful. He was faithful to his vocation, faithful to the vows that he had made. He was faithful in assuming the Methodist Church is good and is a source of good. And we have got to let it lead us. We got to think, for one thing, that the marches and all that was happening on a political sphere. Ken was concerned about his churches. How do we enable these churches to keep functioning? How do we enable these clergy to keep functioning in a stressful time? Generally, as a bishop, I found whenever a pastor says to you, well, I did this part of my prophetic ministry, or I'm a prophet or something, I get really suspicious, because that can cover a multitude of sin. And I also think, I was talking with a young pastor the other day, and is thinking about, was talking about making a hardline statement, a very forceful statement I happen to agree with about LGBTQ inclusion. But I asked him, I said, why, you're a pastor. I don't know why, I can understand why the president needs to make declarations and all, the dean, but these people. There ain't that many of them. Talk to them personally. Try to convert them. That's the way we do stuff. And I said, I feel like if you did this way, making this big statement, you might feel better about yourself, but I don't know that you would accomplish anything. In fact, you might even, to me, that I could imagine Ken Goodson thinking like that about, be with your people, love them, talk to them, visit them, preach to them, comfort them, correct them. That's the way Jesus gets stuff done.
Tom, thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you. And Ken, this was good. It's wonderful that you are contributing to this reminiscence of your father. So thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you.
Ken, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, enjoyed it. Bye.